All right, we're giving this a go. Um, Hopefully this works out. So today, talking about periodization and programming as we enter into our programming phase. Hopefully this is, with this being one of our last presentations, we won't have to go on much further from this, but hopefully this gives you an idea as to how to program, and I'll have a follow-up video with the template as well as the rubric for our program. So looking at periodization and programming. Periodization is a strategic manipulation of an athlete's preparedness through the employment of sequence training phases defined by cycles and stages of working. So, to put that in just a little bit simpler of terms, we're looking at an organized approach to training involving cycles of various aspects of a training program during a specific time period. When we look at periodization, we're looking at it as being broken down into three different levels or three different cycles. And from there, they're going to be broken down even further. But the biggest levels we're looking at are microcycles, mesocycles, and macrocycles. Macro being long term. This is the kind of planning that you have for an overall year. It's an annual training plan. So, kind of looking at the season as a whole, where you want to incorporate certain movements and so on, which we'll talk about. Mesocycles are basically breaking it down by the season, so preseason, in season, postseason, and off season. And then the microcycles are taking those each season and having a phase within that season. So, like preseason, for instance, if I'm looking at my women's basketball team, I had them come in September. We had 4 weeks of training prior to them entering into their practice schedule, and then another 4 weeks before games. So I consider that preseason broken down into two different phases of 4 weeks each. If we're looking at variables that you can manipulate within each season, you're looking at exercise intervals, so maybe duration or distance, the order in which you're doing exercises, the frequency, so maybe you're going to be training more or less. In season, you're looking at about 2 days a week if you're lucky. When you're out of season, you can go anywhere between 3 to 5 days of training. Intensity, so things like your percentage of your 1RM, the recovery you have between reps or sets, repetition, so execution of a specific workload or movement. Series, so a group of sets and recovery intervals. Set is your group of repetitions. Volume is the amount of work performed in a given training session, so 3 sets of 5 reps as an example. Your work to rest ratio, and then also your volume load. So this is the density of volume performed at prescribed intensities. So for example, if you're performing 3 sets of 5 reps at 100 pounds, you're looking at a volume load of 1,500 pounds. And like I said, those are all things or variables that you can manipulate within your program. So think about that when you are writing your own program. Periodization periods, looking at our preparatory period. So this is our first kind of phase that we would look at, or first type of mesocycle that we would look at. As soon as your season ends, you're going to be looking into the prep period. So during this time, there's no competitions. Skill work in the sport in particular is limited because that season just ended. Odds are you're no longer having practices. The goal of this should be to develop a base level or foundation in order to tolerate greater workloads in the future. So that way, when we get into the season, we can be on the field of competition for longer without fatiguing as easier. Same with when we are moving into our strength phase and maximum strength, we can use higher loads or higher intensities, and we're not going to be as fatigued when we're doing it at that point as to where we would be more fatigued if we were to use that now. Relatively low intensity and high volume during this time, so the weights are going to be a little bit lighter, but we're going to have a lot higher reps or a lot more intense tempos. During this time, this prep phase, like we said, this is basically that whole off season. So you're going from as soon as the season ended up until when the season begins. You're going to be breaking that into two specific phases. So being one, your general preparatory phase, or your GPP, that's going to be early on. And then the next one would be your specific preparatory phase, or SPP. The GPP is early. It's a general physical base. So just, simple movements. We're really focusing once again on high volume, low intensity, so low weight, lots of reps, high in regards to the tempos that we're using, the eccentrics, the isos, and so on. You're looking at a larger variety of movements. So this is going to equal to developing general motor abilities and skills. So just having these things that are very general movement patterns so that we're strong and confident in that. As we move away from that GPP, we're going to be looking more towards specific prep phase. So this is going to be more sport specific in regards to their movements and the intervals that we're using within that. When we're looking early on in our preparatory phase, looking at that GPP, we're going to be starting with a hypertrophy / strength endurance. All right, so that's a very early portion. I consider this more of a post-season, so right when the season ends. You're looking at having low to moderate intensity with a high volume. So anywhere between 50 to 75% of your 1 rep max with 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 20 reps. So very high volume, very low intensity. The goals here is to increase our lean body mass overall, as well as develop an endurance base, so kind of building a foundation of rock so that we can move forward with that. And it's also used to stimulate hypertrophic effects while increasing strength endurance. So just kind of increasing that strength, like we said, that lean body mass while developing endurance. From there, we move on to our basic strength phase. So we have that foundation built. Now we're trying to take that endurance, that hypertrophy, that increase in lean body mass that we've accomplished, and we're going to try and turn that into more strength. So looking here, we're trying to increase the strength of the muscles that are essential to the primary sport movements. Looking at heavier loads with lower volume. So now we're going to be doing 80 to 95% of our 1RM to help us develop strength. And we're looking at anywhere between 2 to 6 sets of 2 to 6 reps. So lower volume, higher load, higher intensity in that sense. As we go away from that basic strength portion, all right, we're going to enter into what's that first transition. So this is that link between our prep period and our competition period. So during this time, this can include that preseason aspect that I spoke on earlier. You're going to be seeing a development of max strength as well as power. So power is going to be that strength as well as speed within that. So being able to have that power develop through things like cleans, things like snatches, things like plyometric training. Not to say that you can't work on that throughout the other phases, but this is where we're going to start seeing those be loaded up a little bit more intensely. But yeah, it's that translation of that strength that we built into a power development so that we can be explosive and athletic. The strength power phase, training is going to intensify to near competitive speed / pace. The training will begin to mimic competition in terms of power that we're using and power that we're developing. Low to high loads / low volumes. So emphasis is going to be on speed and explosiveness. So we're going to not necessarily be like we saw with that 80 to 95% of your 1RM with that heavy load, but it can be up to 95, but as low as 30. Because once again, we're working on being as explosive as possible. All right, and to do that, we want to have high quality movement. So we also keep that volume pretty low with 2 to 5 sets of 2 to 5 reps, so we can really focus on having the best potential movement we can possibly have. Then we move into that competitive phase. So now we're in season. So we're preparing our athletes by increasing strength and power, by increasing intensity and decreasing volume. So now we're going to have sport-specific skills and tactics being increased dramatically. The resistance training is going to decrease. So we're going to see an increase in regards to practice and things like that. During this time, we want to see 2 different things happen: maintenance as well as peaking during this period. Peaking is an attempt to place an athlete in peak condition for 1 to 2 weeks. So varying upon the sport, maybe it's going to be an in-season rival we want to peak at. Maybe it's going to be when we get to the playoffs we're going to want to peak at. It might be several times, might be just one time. During that time, you're going to look at high to low intensities / low volumes, so 50 to 93% of our 1RM at only 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps. So very low volume, but really emphasizing the quality of movement, the strength, the speed, everything with that. And then maintenance is the attempt to maintain strength / endurance of the athlete. Moderate to high intensities / moderate volume, so 85 to 93%, 2 to 5 sets of 3 to 6 reps. And just keep it in mind, odds are you're only going to have those athletes about 2 days a week if you're lucky. Now looking at our second transition, so this is the active rest. So this is when the season has come to a close, so it's between that competition and also the beginning of the next annual plan, or that macro cycle that we talked about at the beginning. During this time, you're going to want to have some active rest or restoration. It's going to last about 1 to 4 weeks. Your goal here is an unloading phase in order to prepare that body for subsequent phases or period of training. So we're going to see a reduced overtraining potential because we are asking them to kind of rest and recover, as well as rehabilitate from the injuries that they may have sustained, or just the bruises that may have during that competition, so that they can refresh their body both physically and mentally. So we look at periods in terms of the seasons. Preparatory period is going to be that postseason through that off season. So as soon as the season ends, going past that active rest into the training up until the season starts. So our GPP, focusing on hypertrophy endurance during that postseason and early off season. Transitioning to our specific prep phase, so off season to late off season, and basic strength is going to be within that as well. Our first transitions, that preseason, so like with basketball, we had 8 weeks of that. We're going to go focusing on max strength, as well as really focusing on power and being as explosive as possible. Then we're going to be in competition, looking to peak, to maintain, all the above in that regard. And then second transition, as soon as that season's done, we're going to have that active rest and restoration. So now when we go to our program writing, so thinking about what you're going to be doing when you write your own program, there's a few different categories I want to kind of touch on. First is exercise, then we'll talk about warm-up, progression, tempos, as well as design/layout. So when it comes to our exercises, we've been armed with a ton of different exercise ideas throughout the semester. There's a lot more out there that we didn't touch on, but you can use the various resources you have, as well as me, for that resource to kind of lock in on some of these if you have questions. The things I'm looking at is it going to make sense towards your goal, towards whatever sport you may be competing in, and so on? Is it safe? Are we doing our squats on the floor at a controlled pace, or are we trying to do jump squats on a Bosu ball? Those are things that we want to avoid. Do you have some explosive movements on there? So I would definitely suggest having some types of explosive movement, whether it be Olympic weightlifting or plyometric training, knowing that Olympic weightlifting is a little bit more learning intensive, a little bit more sound in regards to technique, whereas plyometric is going to be less coaching intensive, easier to fix things and so on, easier to learn, and then different ideas like that. Incorporating some kind of core. Where are you incorporating that? Is it at the beginning? Is it at the very end? Is it throughout the workout? Lots of different strategies for that. And then also the planes of movement that are being used. This can kind of go back to make sense in regards to maybe the sport you're training in or so on. A lot of sports have 3 different planes of movements that we work within. Some do not. Some are just one plane of movement. So does this really help with that? Thinking about your goal, thinking about your sport, and so on. The warm-up, you guys, for the most part, have all performed a warm-up up to this point. Does it prepare you for the session? Does it incorporate all the planes of movement you're going to be utilizing? And is it a full body? I think those are the 3 things that I'm looking for when I look at your warm-up. You don't have to get too crazy with the ideas. It's a pretty simple concept. Balance. We talked about lower and upper body pushes and pulls the last few weeks. Are we balancing? Are we going to have a good ratio of lower body to upper body? Are you breaking it down into 3 total body days? Are you going to do 4 days, 2 lower body, 2 upper body? And then within that, do you have an equal number of pushes to pulls? Are you really kind of incorporating the whole body throughout the session, as well as it being vertical and horizontal too? Progression. I would like to see this progress weekly. So is it appropriate in regards to our 12-week? Are we progressing throughout that? We'll see different things in which we can see progression on the side here. Each cycle, are you progressing? Thinking about your future programming. If this is something you want to continue, how are you going to continue to progress through that? Having just a good overall plan that comes back to that macro cycle you're looking at. And then when we do look at progression, things that we can progress, we can progress our sets, we can progress our reps, we can progress our tempos, our movements, etc. So are we increasing the amount of sets or decreasing sets and increasing the intensity of the movement, so increasing the percent of 1 RM you're looking at with sets and reps? Are we dropping down the intensity and also really focusing on the eccentric portion of our workout with that tempo or the isometric and so on? how are we progressing throughout these different movements.